Yeah, so I'll be
Okay,
careful.
okay, everyone. This is Gabriel Amorim from the English Language Testing Society. I'm here with Professor Barry O'Sullivan. He is the head of assessment research and development for the British Council. So first of all, thank you very much, Professor, for being with us today and agreeing to do this interview. We're going to talk a little bit about your experience with language assessment and research. So thank you very much.
Not at all. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you. Forward to your question.
Right. Our sponsor for today's interview is In Times from Seoul, South Korea. And we thank them for that, for sponsoring this interview. I'd like to start with a general question. What made you interested in assessment? How did you become interested in assessment, in language assessment more specifically?
Well, I was actually involved in assessment many years ago in Ireland. I was involved in assessing plain and solid geometry of all things, but I never actually knew that there was a world of English language testing out there until I did my master's degree at Reading back in the early 90s, where I worked with Cyril Weir, and Cyril was my supervisor. And once I was not actually interested in his area of testing. He was very world famous, but I wasn't interested. I was interested in discourse analysis. So I wanted to see how people changed the way they spoke depending on who they were speaking to. And after a while struggling to collect data, he told me, oh, it's a terrible idea. And I said, it's not a terrible idea. What would happen if it was one of your tests? And he said, nobody's ever actually thought about that before. And suddenly I was interested in testing, and I thought, wow, this is a really interesting area. And then I realized that I had a couple of the skills that you need to get to learn more about testing. And I found from day one that I just loved it. It was the best thing that ever happened in terms of study.
Right. Okay. And I know as you developed your research in language assessment that you've been particularly interested in this socio-cognitive test development model. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Actually, the idea for it came during my PhD, because in my PhD, I was following up on my master's idea, basically of looking at how the person you were interacting with impacted on your performance. So I became very interested in the individual, the test taker, as a participant in a social event or a social interaction.
Right.
And I started to talk a lot with my friend, as he had become then, Cyril Weir, who was interested in the cognitive dimension of language production, whereas I was interested more in the social element or the social. So really the socio-cognitive, as the name suggests, we basically blended the two together. And that's where it came from. That's where the whole idea came from. Back around 2000, we started to talk about it first. And we actually wrote our first paper on it in 2002. And we had different ideas. He was interested in frameworks and in practicalities of helping people to make tests. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of young and foolish still. And I was thinking, oh, we need a good solid theory and a model behind this. So I started applying the socio-cognitive model in some projects around the world, and then realizing actually there's some bits of it don't work as well as we think it works. So how can we fix it? And then what might the underlying model be? So and that work has continued, until my recent work with Micheline Chaloux-Deville, another preeminent scholar in the US. We did a book together on this idea on validity, and we have what I think is a really interesting chapter on the integrated arguments approach, where we break it down further into a sort of a theoretical position. And then we looked at how we might practically apply this in a paper recently in LAQ, where we looked at language testing, the validity of language testing for migrants. So yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, a really interesting journey that basically has been going for nearly 30 years. And I stop and think about it, I think, oh my God. But yeah, it's been great.
There's so much to learn and to do research on, you know.
Absolutely. And there's no end to it. You know, in some cases,
Yeah.
some people might say, oh God, there's no end to it. But for me, that's what makes it interesting.
Right. Before we started recording our conversation, you were talking about how the pandemic affected your traveling, because that's what you've been doing a lot of traveling over these years. How do you think the pandemic affected or impacted, you know, assessment practices, especially in your context there in Europe, and assessment and teaching practices too, because I think they go together.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I very strongly believe that they go together. And I think one of the critical weaknesses we have in our education systems is we try to treat them as two different things,
Yeah.
whereas they're critically aligned. If they're not aligned fully within a system, the system isn't going to work. It's not rocket science. It's thought about. You can be working in silos. But I think the pandemic, certainly in the organization I work with in the British Council, has taught us that, you know, we need to start thinking again about how we deliver our learning, both how we deliver it, where we deliver it, who we deliver it to. So I think it's caused us, certainly in the British Council, to stop and think, you know, we have to start thinking more about how we get the best out of technology, because I think in the panic of the pandemic, people went into teaching online, and then maybe people who administer these courses think, well, actually, it's a bit cheaper. We might save some money. But the reality is that the critical role of the teacher has been reinforced, and a centrality of the teacher. And I really hope that we don't lose that now, because I think people were beginning to think, oh, you know, with all this technology, the teacher may not be as important as the teacher once was. But actually, no.
Yeah.
Without the teacher, the technology is not really very good. And in terms of assessment, I think a similar panic has forced a lot of institutions to accept tests that really aren't up to it. In some ways, it's good. I think there was a danger that testing was becoming stagnant. There was no real dramatic change, and there has been change, and it's been forced on us. But not all of it, I think, is good. I look at some of the tests that are out there, well-known tests, and they look like they were developed in the 1950s. And, you know, they have lovely customer experience, and it's lovely, beautiful looking websites and stuff. But the reality is, stand back and think, what is this actually testing? What's it telling me about these people? And generally, it's not telling you anything that's of use, to be honest. So I think there's a positive, but there's also a bit of a negative. And I think we need to find that balance on both sides, teaching and assessment.
Right, great. Can you tell us a little bit about the projects you've been involved at the moment with the British Council?
I can. I'm lucky that I have so many.
A little spoiler.
A little spoiler. I'll talk about a few of them. Just the main ones, I think. One of the projects we're working on in the council is the Future of English projects, where we've gone back to a very well-known publication called English Next by David Gradall in 2006, I think it was. And he was looking at what direction might English language take over the next number of decades. And during the pandemic, very luckily, one of my colleagues in the British Council, Mike Solly, suggested that we should go back and revisit Gradall and start thinking about the future of English as of now. So we've been doing a really interesting project. I'm going to be talking about it at this Teach All Arabia conference on Friday here in Dubai. And you can expect to see a report on this, a good serious publication from the British Council team in the next few months, possibly in May, where we actually set up all of these very high-level focus groups around the world. With 14 of them, and we had people representing. We had 92 participants representing 49 countries, and it was really interesting. And we asked people to discuss what they felt the future might be, and we've got some really interesting themes emerging from that. That's one part. Another thing I'm working on, very different, is I've always been interested in automated scoring, and fascinated that people just accepted it without question, that there's no such thing as questioning the validation. How do you know that the scoring system is working as you think it should work? So a few of us in the council, again, who are interested in this area, have been working on developing an idea that came from the tech industry called model cards by a woman called Mitchell and a whole bunch of other people. It was published 2019. And we're looking at adapting the concept of model cards to help us to understand what are the questions we need to be asking about these AI scoring systems. How do we know that they're actually working and that there isn't any built-in bot? So that's another project. We also have a really fascinating new project going on within the group where we're looking at new ideas or approaches to assessment, which are very much production focused. Because my own personal view, and it's just my view at the moment, is that we've kind of lost track of the communicative method. I think it fell down the usual cracks of being, we needed to be boxed into units that can be sold easily and can be taught easily. And I'm thinking we should be moving away from that. We should be thinking about the real use of language. What's language about? It's all about production. Mm-hmm. The other skills, listening and reading, are enabling as far as I'm concerned. I read loads of stuff so that I can write or I can talk about it. That's what I do. That's what most people do. And the last project I'm working on is a personal interest one, is with the Chinese imperial examination system. I've just finished a paper with a colleague of mine from a Chinese colleague of mine. So we're hoping to get that published in the next couple of months. And I'm working on a radio documentary script, which just to keep me off the street. So that's really interesting. We could learn so much from that examination system. It's unbelievable.
Right.
So,
excellent.
Keep an eye.
I'm writing it down. I'm going to keep an eye on it. Yeah. Any advice or any recommendation would you give to researchers, practitioners around the world who want to go to invest in assessment research? I think they got a gist from the projects that you're working on, but if you had to give them some kind of recommendation?
I think testing is all about doing. It's about doing stuff. Get involved in building tests, making tests. If possible, train to be an item writer or train to be a rater or examiner, and learn how the inside of the system works. Mm-hmm. And then bring your own interests into the considering more closely about how things are designed. A lot of tests are very simple looking, but the design is quite intricate, and you bring your own interests to it. You bring the aspect of what brought you into teaching or into applied linguistics or into assessment. You bring that to the fore and say, this is what I really want to know about, because you never know everything about testing. It's too big. So you've got to be humble and accept, I know a bit about it. I know a lot more about it now than I did 30 years ago, but I know I'll never know everything about it. And I've given up worrying about it. But the biggest thing is question everything. No matter what it is, question it. Like even Einstein's theories are being questioned. Everything should be questioned. So just because a theory is written by a famous person, and it could be anybody, doesn't mean it's absolutely perfect. It's most likely not perfect. In fact, I'm involved in a few theories and they're all imperfect, because a theory is imperfect. abstract representation of what you think is happening.
Right.
So you might get it right, but the chances are you're not going to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're lucky enough to be an Einstein or a Newton, you might have a better chance than an O'Sullivan. We'll put it like that. So don't think too much of it. But it is down to doing and getting involved. And don't just read books about it. You learn nothing. I studied it and I worked in universities for many years. And I left the university system 10 years ago to join the British Council to actually develop a real test, the Aptis test, from scratch. And I had to learn about all of the other bits that go around the test. How do you actually get the test out to people and make sure that it gets scored and it's scored consistently and accurately? So you're not going to learn any of that from a book. You've got to go out and do it and learn from brilliant people who are actually already doing that job. So it's all about doing it. Get involved. Don't just sit back and read books.
All right.
Read them, but don't just read them.
Don't just read the books. Right. Okay. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. And I'll be looking out, and I think a lot of people will be looking out for those publications which are coming out soon. Thank you very much.
There's those, and there's plenty more. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Gabrielle, and I hope we get the chance to do it again sometime.
Sure. Well, sure. Thank you.